When you think about the sheer scale of wealth and power in American history, well, one figure looms larger than almost any other. John D. Rockefeller Sr.
Mm, absolutely.
I mean, by the height of his power, his Standard Oil empire commanded something like, what was it, 90 to 95% of U.S. refineries and pipelines.
It's almost unbelievable, isn't it? Just grasping that level of market control.
Exactly. So the big question, the one we really want to dig into for you, is how? How did a man who started from relatively modest circumstances build something so dominant so fast and basically reshape an entire industry in the process?
Right. And our deep dive into this material, into the information we've gathered, suggests it wasn't just being in the right place at the right time,
No.
or even just pure ruthlessness, although, yeah, we'll definitely get into that side of things too.
Oh, for sure.
But the sources really point to two deeply ingrained traits: a relentless, almost unbelievable discipline, and a sweeping, far-reaching vision.
And that's what we're here to unpack for you. This dive is specifically tailored, looking at the info you've brought to the table, to understand the engine behind that empire.
We're going to try and pull out the key insights on how Rockefeller built Standard Oil by focusing on these twin pillars, discipline and vision.
So we'll explore his origins.
Yeah, where he came from, the actual nuts and bolts of how he forged the empire, the nature of his vision for the whole industry.
How that discipline showed up in, everything he did.
Exactly. The specific ways it manifested. His global ambitions, too, which were huge. And then finally, how his approach stacks up against modern management ideas, the stuff often labeled the Rockefeller habits.
Right. So our goal here is really to give you that essential understanding, that kind of shortcut, to grasp the foundational mindset that allowed one man to achieve such unparalleled scale.
It's about seeing the underlying architecture of that success, isn't it?
Yeah, totally. So what can we learn from this historical deep dive about building something that truly lasts and, the forces of power and wealth? Let's get into it.
Okay, so to really understand Rockefeller, you almost had to start right at the beginning. He was born in Richford, New York, back in 1839.
And his family, they weren't exactly poor, but modest means is probably the right description.
Yeah, modest is fair. And his childhood, it was marked by frequent moves and a real necessity for careful spending. Frugality was sort of baked in early.
And the information highlights this really fascinating, almost contradictory dynamic with his parents, right? That seems key.
Oh, absolutely crucial to his formation. His mother, Eliza, she was a devout Baptist, and she instilled these incredibly strong principles of hard work, strict discipline, and even charitable giving. He actually practiced that from a very young age.
She represented stability, order, piety, maybe.
Exactly. But then you have his father, William Avery Rockefeller, known as Bill. He was a much more, let's say, chaotic force.
Right. A traveling salesman, often gone, sometimes involved in questionable dealings.
Putting it mildly sometimes, yeah.
Yeah.
And this created real financial uncertainty for the family, real precariousness.
And that instability seems to have just deeply impressed upon young John D. the value of thrift. And maybe, as you said, a certain shrewdness. Or cunning.
Probably both. It's this blend, isn't it? The steadfast discipline and maybe moral grounding from his mother, combined with the financial uncertainty and perhaps that cunning learned from his father that seems to have forged his unique and, complex character.
A character capable of immense business drive, but also, later in life, that unparalleled philanthropy.
Precisely. And you see that drive, that intense industriousness, showing up incredibly early. Right. I mean, even as a young boy, he wasn't idle.
Raising turkeys, selling candy, doing odd jobs for neighbors.
Yeah. And the detail about him saving $50 by age 12, that's pretty telling.
It's not just saving, though, is it? That was his first recorded business transaction, apparently.
Exactly. He loaned that $50 to a local farmer, and he charged 7% interest. Think about that. A 12-year-old seeing money not just as something to spend, but as capital, something to be deployed for a return.
Wow. That's an early flash of the financial acumen, and definitely the discipline of saving and investing that would, define him.
Totally. He got his formal education mostly in Cleveland after the family moved there. High school, and then a short but clearly impactful bookkeeping course at a commercial college.
Finished it in 3 months instead of the usual 6.
That efficiency, that focus, It was already there, wasn't it? And his first real job at 16, this was 1855, as an assistant bookkeeper for Hewitt and Tuttle, a commission firm. The sources really emphasized this wasn't just a job, it was foundational.
It honed his attention to detail to an almost obsessive degree.
That's the word. He kept meticulous records of everything. Company finances, sure, but also his own personal expenses. Everything.
I remember reading about him treating his personal ledger with almost religious reverence, like it was
It
sacred.
speaks volumes, doesn't it? That early experience, tracking every single penny, seeing exactly how financial details translated into profit or loss, it instilled this level of cost consciousness and meticulousness that became just deeply embedded.
It wasn't just a task for him, it was a discipline he would later scale up to an entire industry.
And starting at, what, $3.57 a week?
Hmm.
And unpaid for the first 3 months. It just underscores that foundation built on necessity and sheer diligence.
So by 1859, he was ready to strike out on his own. He combined his savings, that $1,000 he diligently saved up,
Uh-huh.
with another $1,000 borrowed from his father, the infamous Bill,
Right, from Bill.
to co-found Clark and Rockefeller, a commission business that apparently did quite well, especially during the Civil War years.
Yeah, that early success must have just validated his disciplined approach to finance and, fueled his ambition.
So from this disciplined, financially shrewd background, he steps into the oil industry in the early 1860s.
Yeah.
And the picture painted is one of pure chaos, right? After that first big oil discovery in Pennsylvania in 59.
Total chaos, wild speculation, boom and bust cycles everywhere, incredible inefficiency, just messy.
And where others saw this chaotic gamble, maybe a lottery,
Huh.
Rockefeller saw an opportunity to impose order.
Precisely. He didn't jump into the speculative frenzy of drilling for oil. That wasn't his game. His strategic insight, and it was brilliant, was to focus on refining. He invested in a Cleveland refinery in 1863
Why refining specifically? What was the thinking there?
because drilling was so unpredictable, totally reliant on luck, fluctuating supply, just wild swings. Refining, on the other hand, offered more controllable variables.
Like input costs, process efficiency, output quality?
Exactly. It was a much more stable segment of the value chain, at least
Yeah.
potentially. And that focus was a key part of his vision for a predictable, orderly industry. By 1865, he bought out some partners to take sole control of what became the largest refinery in Cleveland.
And then fast forward to 1870, and we see the birth of Standard Oil Company of Ohio, capitalized at $1 million, which was huge then.
Huge, and with key partners like his brother William and, crucially, Henry Flagler. John D. was president and the dominant shareholder right from the start.
Even the name Standard Oil, it feels so deliberate, like a statement.
It absolutely was. It was chosen specifically to convey reliability, consistency, a promise of order in this really disorderly market. His vision wasn't just to build a successful company, it was literally to set the standard for the entire industry.
And their growth. I mean, it was frankly terrifyingly fast. It seems like it was this combination of, yes, operational excellence, but also strategic acquisitions and, well, tactics that were highly effective, but also deeply controversial.
That's the core of it. The sources detail this dual approach he took: vertical integration and horizontal integration.
Okay, let's break those down. Vertical first.
Vertical integration meant controlling the entire supply chain connected to refining. And this wasn't just about power, though it gave them that. It was driven by his obsessive discipline for cost control and efficiency.
Like the famous example of bringing barrel making in-house.
That's the classic example. He cut the cost of a barrel from about $3 down to less than $1.50.
Oh.
By owning the timberlands, the drying kilns, making his own barrels on site. They manufactured their own sulfuric acid, owned their own drayage teams, warehouses, even built their own fleet of tank cars. The insight here is seeing how his ingrained discipline around cost translated into controlling every single variable, cutting waste everywhere, and gaining this massive competitive edge.
So it wasn't just refining the oil, it was controlling the entire ecosystem around the refinery.
Exactly, from raw materials right through to transport. And then you had the horizontal integration piece.
Which one?
The aggressive acquisition of competing refineries. This was his infamous "our plan."
Our plan. Sounds ominous.
It kind of was for his competitors. He would systematically approach rivals and essentially make them an offer they couldn't refuse, either cash or often Standard Oil stock.
And what happened to the refineries they bought?
Well, the inefficient plants were usually shut down pretty quickly. The better ones were upgraded, integrated into the standard system.
This led to things like the Cleveland Massacre in 1872, didn't it?
Yeah, that was a really concentrated campaign. Standard Oil basically absorbed or eliminated most of Cleveland's competing refineries in just a matter of weeks. Brutally effective.
And the result, by the early 1880s, that staggering market share, 90 to 95% of U.S. refining capacity in pipelines. It's hard to even conceive of that level of dominance today.
Unprecedented, just unprecedented.
Now, we have to talk about the controversial methods used to achieve that dominance. The sources don't shy away from this. The secret railroad rebates are maybe the prime example.
Oh, absolutely central. He leveraged his massive shipping volume because he controlled so much oil to secure preferential secret rates from the railroads.
So while his smaller competitors were paying the official published freight fees,
Standard Oil would be getting significant discounts behind the scenes. We see examples like a 71% discount from the Lakeshore Railroad back in 1868. Huge.
and sometimes they even got drawbacks. What were those?
That was even more galling to competitors. Essentially, the railroads would pay Standard Oil a portion of the fees that competitors paid to ship their oil.
Wait, so competitors were not only paying higher rates, but some of the money they paid was actually going to Standard Oil.
That's right. It sounds incredible, but it happened. It made it incredibly difficult, almost impossible, for smaller refiners to compete on cost.
Wow. And there were other tactics, too.
Yeah, sources also point to accusations of predatory pricing, basically, temporarily slashing prices in a specific market just long enough to drive competitors out of business, then raising them again. And industrial espionage, trying to get competitors' secrets.
It's no wonder these tactics fueled such immense public resentment.
Absolutely. It laid the groundwork for the whole antitrust movement later on.
But how did Rockefeller himself view these methods? He had a justification, right?
He did. And it's important to understand his perspective, even if you find the methods abhorrent. He saw them as necessary, almost, morally justified steps, necessary to bring order to what he genuinely viewed as a chaotic, inefficient, and incredibly wasteful industry.
His famous quote, "Competition is a sin."
That sums up his view perfectly. From his perspective, intense, unfettered competition just caused instability, bankruptcies, wild price swings. He thought it hurt the industry overall. He truly seemed to believe that consolidation under a single, highly efficient entity like Standard Oil was actually better for everyone in the long run.
Better because it brought stability and ultimately lower prices for consumers through scale and efficiency.
That was the argument. He saw himself less as a predator and more as a kind of savior for the industry, absorbing these weaker, less efficient companies to strengthen the whole system.
A view that obviously contrasted sharply with his critics and free market advocates.
Diametrically opposed. And yeah, sources really highlight the ruthlessness involved controlling access to essential supplies, manipulating transport options. But understanding his internal rationale, this vision of order and efficiency, is key to understanding his drive.
Okay, so beyond just consolidation, Standard Oil under his leadership was also relentlessly focused on efficiency within the plants themselves, right? Finding value everywhere.
Oh, absolutely. This was another huge manifestation of his discipline and vision. He was obsessed with eliminating waste. He drove innovation constantly to find uses for byproducts that other refiners were literally just dumping.
Like gasoline before cars were common.
Exactly. Gasoline was largely a waste product then. Standard Oil used it to fuel their own machinery. They developed markets for lubricating oils, paraffin wax, even petroleum jelly. Vaseline has a connection there. They were essentially turning waste streams into profit streams.
That's brilliant. And the investment in R&D, like finding a way to process that difficult, sour Ohio crude oil.
That's a great example of the long-term thinking. When they acquired oil fields known for this high-sulfur, sour crude, which was hard to refine, Rockefeller didn't just write it off as a loss. He tasked his scientists to figure out how to make this stuff usable.
And they did.
They did. They developed a refining process to remove the impurities, making vast quantities of previously almost worthless oil profitable. It highlights that visionary long-term perspective and the discipline to invest heavily in solving complex technical problems.
Now, managing this sprawling, incredibly complex empire, it required new ways of organizing things, didn't it? The Standard Oil Trust in 1882 seems like a prime example.
It was absolutely groundbreaking. It brought together about 40 different companies under a single board of 9 trustees, with Rockefeller at the head.
Why was that so significant?
Because it allowed for centralized control and coordination across multiple states and multiple operations in a way that traditional corporate structures just couldn't handle at that scale. It effectively created a blueprint for the modern large conglomerate, managing a vast industrial empire.
And it was designed with a complex, maybe deliberately confusing legal structure, hard for outsiders to penetrate.
Yes, secrecy and maintaining control were absolutely paramount. That structure was described as a maze of legal structures.
But the trust didn't last forever, legally speaking.
No, it was eventually challenged and ordered dissolved by the Ohio Supreme Court in 1892, but they were masters of adaptation. They essentially continued operating, and then in 1899 they formed Standard Oil Company, New Jersey, as a holding company.
Which basically achieved the same goal of central control over all their dispersed assets.
Pretty much, yeah.
Yeah.
A different legal structure, same effective control.
So, okay, summing up this empire forging phase, the methods were undeniably controversial. They led directly to the antitrust movement, culminating in that massive 1911 Supreme Court order breaking up Standard Oil into over 30 independent companies. But the efficiency gains were real. Kerosene prices actually
Yep.
did fall.
They absolutely did, significantly. We see prices dropping from around 58 cents a gallon in 1865 down to 26 cents by 1870. The scale and the relentless drive for efficiency did benefit consumers in that specific way, providing cheaper lamp fuel.
But at a cost. The concentration of power, the perceived unfairness of the tactics, the sheer wealth generated, it fueled massive public outcry. Figures like Ida Tarbell and her expose, The History of the Standard Oil Company.
That book was a landmark of muckraking journalism, really crystallizing the negative public image of Rockefeller and Standard Oil.
So, forging this empire clearly wasn't just luck or simply being ruthless. It was driven by this potent mix, strategic foresight, like focusing on refining, an unprecedented drive for both vertical and horizontal integration, an obsession with efficiency, and yes, aggressive tactics. But all of it seemed guided by that singular vision he had for an orderly, consolidated industry.
That idea of order really does seem to be the absolute central theme of his vision for the oil industry, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It wasn't just about making money, although he certainly did that. It felt like it was about imposing structure on chaos.
Where others saw the Wild West, he saw a system just waiting to be built, an opportunity for efficiency and predictability.
Exactly. His vision was fundamentally about creating a rational, efficient, and predictable flow of products from the producer, the wellhead, all the way to the final consumer. And this belief, this vision, was the driving force behind his pioneering efforts in vertical integration. Controlling every step wasn't just for cost savings, it was for creating that systematic, orderly delivery.
And his early focus on refining instead of exploration fits right in here too, doesn't it? Choosing the segment with more predictable variables as the bedrock for this orderly system.
Absolutely. It speaks to his long-term perspective. He wasn't interested in the boom and bust speculation of drilling. He was building an enduring structure, something that would last. Systematically controlling every aspect of the refining and distribution chain that was a calculated long-term strategy, not just reacting to opportunities.
And the massive investments in infrastructure, pipelines, storage facilities, tank cars that required huge upfront capital.
A huge commitment, yeah. And it reflected that long-term vision for total industry control and development. He was building for the decades ahead.
Plus the foresight to invest in R&D anticipating future market needs, like finding uses for gasoline even before the automobile age really took off, or figuring out how to process different kinds of crude oil. That shows vision too.
It shows a vision that went way beyond just optimizing current operations. It was about actively shaping the future possibilities of the entire industry. And of course, this vision was completely intertwined with his very strong and controversial views on competition and capitalism.
Competition is a sin. That quote just really nails his perspective, doesn't it?
It absolutely does.
Yeah.
He was a firm believer in a kind of industrial social Darwinism. He famously said something like, "The growth of a large business is merely a survival of the fittest."
Wow.
He genuinely saw intense competition as wasteful, inefficient. He thought it led to overcapacity, price wars, instability, things that ultimately harmed the industry and maybe even consumers in the long run. His vision was that consolidation, led by the most efficient player, namely Standard Oil, was not only inevitable, but actually desirable.
Desirable because it brought stability and lower costs through massive scale.
That was his conviction. He genuinely seemed to see himself as the one who could bring that necessary order by absorbing or eliminating the weaker, less efficient competitors.
Which, as we noted, put him in direct opposition to proponents of free markets and really fueled that whole anti-monopoly movement.
Right. But the scale of his vision was just unprecedented for the time. He wasn't just trying to build a bigger company within the existing framework. He was trying to engineer an entire industrial ecosystem, first across Ohio, then the nation.
And the innovative organizational structures he created, like the trust, they were necessary tools to actually manage that vision. The sheer size and complexity of integrating so many different operations and companies across different states.
Absolutely. It was a central control model designed for unprecedented scale, and yeah, other large corporations definitely studied and emulated it. And his vision didn't stop at the U.S. borders either. It extended globally.
Yeah.
He aimed to dominate the international oil trade, too.
It's hard to imagine the kind of pressure he must have been under, trying to execute such a massive, controversial vision while facing constant public and press attacks. Did the sources mention his stress levels?
They do. They note he experienced significant stress and anxiety, particularly during the most intense periods of consolidation, which is understandable.
Yeah, I'd say.
Yet despite that pressure, his fundamental conviction in his vision, this idea of a rationalized, efficient industry built on large-scale organization, remained incredibly firm, rock solid.
So the vision itself, while hugely controversial and eventually challenged in court, it fundamentally reshaped the American industrial landscape. It set the precedent for modern, large-scale, integrated corporations. It wasn't just about seeing an opportunity. It was about imposing a desired structure, anticipating future needs, and having this unwavering belief in the necessity of scale for efficiency.
But, having that grand vision is one thing. Bringing it to life,
Yeah.
especially at that speed and that scale, that required something else, something more practical.
Execution.
Extraordinary execution, fueled by that other pillar we mentioned, unwavering discipline.
Ah, the engine that powered the vision. And this discipline, it wasn't just a professional habit he put on at the office, was it? It seems like it was deeply personal, ingrained.
Absolutely. It seems like it was forged in his upbringing, reinforced by those early experiences as a bookkeeper. And it manifested in several key ways. An almost obsessive attention to detail, extreme frugality and cost control, a highly structured personal routine, and just a relentless work ethic.
His attention to detail is legendary. The story about the solder drops on the kerosene cans is a classic.
It's perfect because it's so small, so granular, yet the impact was huge. He apparently noticed that workers were using 40 drops of solder to seal the top of a kerosene can. He asked them to try 38. Leaks. But 39 drops worked perfectly. Saving one single drop of solder per can seems completely trivial, right?
Until you multiply it by millions and millions of cans.
Exactly. It translated into enormous cost savings across the entire operation, just from that one tiny change. It wasn't just a quirky anecdote. It demonstrates how his immaculately meticulous attention to detail, as has been described, translated directly into a real competitive advantage.
That level of scrutiny, it links right back to his early training, right? Treating those ledgers as sacred, guiding decisions with data over emotion.
Completely. It allowed him to find and exploit efficiencies in processes that competitors just didn't see or bother with.
And that relentless focus on frugality and cost consciousness, that was absolutely central to Standard Oil's whole operational philosophy.
It was embedded in everything they did. We talked about the vertical integration, making their own barrels, owning timber, building drying kilns right on site, employing their own plumbers. All of it was aimed at driving down cost at every single step of the process.
And his abhorrence of waste, finding profitable uses for every byproduct.
That wasn't just about being tidy. It was fundamental to his cost control strategy. Turning refinery residues, things others threw away, into valuable products like gasoline for their own machinery, lubricating oils, wax. It directly boosted the bottom line.
And that ruthless efficiency is what allowed Standard Oil to systematically undercut competitors on price while still remaining highly profitable.
Absolutely. His personal discipline was just as remarkable and consistent, too. Sources describe his daily routine as basically unchanged for 60 years, arriving at the office at 9:15 a.m. sharp, always impeccably dressed, morning meetings, lunch precisely at noon.
His schedule was described as robotic and obsessive, wasn't it? So predictable you could apparently set your watch by him.
That's the description. And that structure wasn't just limited to his work life. He followed a strict diet, practiced slow, deliberate eating for digestion. He even marked September 26th every single year as Job Day.
Job day.
Yeah, celebrating the anniversary of getting his very first job as a bookkeeper. It highlights how deeply he valued perseverance, diligence, and the start of his disciplined path. He even articulated his belief on this, saying something like, the more structure you have in your life, the more freedom you will have.
Interesting. Freedom from chaos, maybe. Freedom to focus energy, to execute effectively.
Precisely. That seems to be the idea. And this intense personal discipline wasn't just his own thing. He scaled it into the organization. It created a culture of efficiency and responsibility within Standard Oil.
He delegated, obviously, he had to. But he remained deeply involved.
Very involved, ensuring his core principles permeated the company. He consistently plowed profits back into the business for expansion and improvement. There's a great phrase describing his approach: daring in design, cautious in execution, Big vision, but meticulously careful implementation.
And he talked explicitly about the power of concentration, didn't he?
He did. He posed the question, something along the lines of, do not many of us who fail to achieve big things fail because we lack concentration? The art of concentrating the mind on the thing to be done at the proper time and to the exclusion of everything else.
Wow, that really sums up his focus.
It does. This unwavering, systematic effort to build systems, control costs relentlessly, optimize every single process that was the engine, that's what translated his grand vision into this dominant physical reality.
Yeah.
It was the vision plus rigorous, scaled execution. His personal discipline truly set the standard, literally, for the entire organization.
So those famous habits and routines, they weren't just personal quirks. They were kind of the operational blueprint that created the capacity for such focused, incredibly effective action. That idea, again, routine sets you free.
And his vision, as we touched on earlier, it wasn't confined just to the United States. Standard Oil had serious global ambitions, and remarkably early on.
Right. By the late 19th, early 20th century, it wasn't just a U.S. giant. It was a truly formidable international force, exporting products all over the world.
Driven primarily, at first, by the huge overseas markets for kerosene. Lamp oil was essential everywhere before electricity became widespread.
So before the 1880s, the U.S. was the main oil producer, which gave Standard Oil a kind of default near-monopoly position internationally just through exports.
Pretty much. Initially, their approach abroad was relatively simple. Sell the kerosene in barrels to local wholesalers in foreign countries, and basically let those local entrepreneurs handle the distribution and marketing within their own markets.
But then things changed. Competition started popping up from places like Russia, Romania, the Dutch East Indies.
Exactly. That competition emerged, particularly from Russian oil fields, and it prompted a major strategic shift in how Standard Oil approached foreign markets.
So what did they do? This was around 1888 to 1892.
Yeah, in that period, they fundamentally reorganized their approach. They started mirroring their domestic strategy abroad. Instead of just selling to wholesalers, they began partnering with, or in some cases acquiring, local entrepreneurs, particularly in Europe.
So Standard Oil would provide the capital and the oil, and the local partners would bring the market knowledge and maybe existing infrastructure.
A very smart combination. It allowed them to build a much more controlled, efficient distribution system overseas rather than just relying on intermediaries. They focused heavily on Western Europe. Initially, it was profitable, and it offered a better strategic position against their rising competitors.
And they had success with this.
Oh, yeah. By 1890, for instance, they had achieved pretty clear dominance in markets like Scandinavia using this partnership or acquisition model.
And managing this global expansion must have required significant organizational infrastructure back home. The Standard Oil Trust, even with its legal issues domestically, provided that needed centralized control for international operations, too.
It absolutely did. It's actually remarkable. By 1885, something like 70% of Standard Oil's total business was international. That's huge.
70%. Wow.
Yeah. They established a dedicated office right in New York City specifically to manage all these overseas activities.
Wow.
They recognized early on that international operations required specialized management and coordination.
And it clearly went far beyond just exporting barrels. They were investing heavily in infrastructure abroad, too.
Just like they did domestically. Building storage depots, wharfage, warehouses. They were replicating that control over the entire value chain, but on a global scale.
The logistical challenge must have been immense, projecting that kind of power and efficiency across vast distances in an era without modern communication tech, without the internet, without easy air travel.
Staggering to think about. And they had to navigate all these complex and varied legal systems in different countries, different competitive landscapes. Sources even note their involvement, later on after 1907, in international cartel agreements with some of their major competitors.
Really? Cartels?
Yeah, particularly in places like Scandinavia. It shows a very pragmatic, if again, potentially controversial, approach to managing global competition. Once they couldn't just dominate everywhere, they'd cooperate to maintain stability and prices when needed.
So the overall perception, both at home and abroad, was that Standard Oil basically owned and controlled every single aspect of the oil trade.
That was certainly the perception, and in many ways, it was close to the reality. And this massive global reach was really just a natural, perhaps inevitable extension of Rockefeller's core vision, creating this orderly, integrated, dominant oil enterprise, but scaled up to encompass the entire world market.
The challenge, though, must have been adapting those disciplined, efficient American strategies for all these incredibly diverse international markets while somehow maintaining that tight, centralized control.
A huge challenge. It really makes Standard Oil a key early example of a truly global corporation, facing the kinds of complexities that multinational companies still grapple with today.
Okay, so now let's leap forward to today, because you often hear certain management principles referred to as the Rockefeller habits.
Hmm.
There's this framework, usually presented as a list of 10 core disciplines,
Right?
that's supposedly inspired by his success and is used by consultants and businesses for scaling companies, for growth.
Yeah, these modern habits, they include things like having a healthy and aligned executive team, making sure everyone's aligned with the number one priority for the quarter, establishing clear communication rhythms.
Assigning accountability for everything.
Right. Collecting employee input, collecting customer input, defining core values clearly, having a clear strategy everyone knows.
Measuring performance quantitatively, promoting transparency, that kind of stuff.
Exactly. That's the typical list you see.
But as the sources we looked at clarify, this isn't actually a list that Rockefeller himself used or wrote down, is it?
No, not at all. That's a really important distinction to make. The 10 Rockefeller habits, as they're usually presented, that's a modern interpretation. It's a codified framework that was developed much later based on observing elements of what seemed to make Standard Oil successful under Rockefeller's leadership. But it's definitely not a direct historical checklist from his time. It's a contemporary tool.
And some of those habits, like, say, actively seeking broad employee input or customer feedback, that sounds pretty different from the historical accounts of Standard Oil, which seemed much more top-down, autocratic almost.
They definitely are different in emphasis and method. Modern management thinking, which is reflected in habits like soliciting employee and customer feedback, puts a much bigger emphasis on participative approaches, on being customer-centric.
Yeah.
Historical Standard Oil was, as you say, notably top-down.
Decisions made by a small group.
Yeah, autocratic is probably fair. They valued secrecy immensely. Major decisions were made by that small, tight group of trustees. The whole idea of a healthy executive team engaging in open debate and having, psychological safety as we understand it today, that's really anachronistic. It doesn't map well into the Standard Oil of the late 19th century.
Okay, so it's not a direct historical blueprint, but you're saying there is a real resonance. There are connections between the modern habits and his core principles.
Oh, absolutely. That's why they bear his name, right? Many fundamental elements of that modern framework align powerfully with his documented approach and how Standard Oil actually operated.
Okay, let's walk through some of them. Like, the executive team is healthy and aligned. How does that compare?
Well, while the internal dynamic of a Standard Oil trustees might not match a modern ideal of open debate and vulnerability, they were unquestionably a small, incredibly powerful group. And they were tightly aligned on strategy and execution, all under Rockefeller's very strong leadership. So alignment, absolutely. Healthy in the modern sense?
Yeah.
Probably not.
Okay, what about everyone is aligned with the hashtag one thing that needs to be accomplished this quarter?
Rockefeller's entire operation was relentlessly aligned around singular driving objectives: consolidating the industry, achieving unprecedented efficiency, dominating markets. Our plan was the number one thing for years, pursued with incredible focus.
So the intense alignment on a key objective was definitely there. The quarterly rhythm part is more modern.
Exactly. The quarterly cadence is a modern management practice. But the underlying principle of intense company-wide alignment on a crucial objective that was absolutely core to how Standard Oil functioned.
Okay, communication and accountability. How do those map?
Well, communication rhythm is established, and information moves through the organization accurately and quickly. Standard Oil certainly had incredibly effective top-down communication. Directives and goals flowed down from Rockefeller and the trustees and were implemented throughout the vast organization. He maintained strict control.
But the modern habit seems to emphasize transparency and information flowing throughout the organization, maybe upwards and sideways too.
Right. And that diverges significantly from Standard Oil's deliberate culture of secrecy, which was aimed squarely at protecting its competitive advantage. They weren't focused on broad transparency.
But accountability, that sounds like a very strong parallel.
A major one. Every facet of the organization has a person assigned with accountability for ensuring goals are met. This was a hallmark of Standard Oil's structure. The trust, and later the holding company, were designed with incredibly clear lines of authority and responsibility. Accountability for operational efficiency, for cost control, for meeting market demands. It was deeply embedded in the system. This drive for clear ownership and responsibility is a direct link to modern principles of operational excellence.
So while some habits, like maybe quantitatively assessing all employees in detail or that emphasis on transparency, those are more modern evolutions.
Yes, definitely. Those aspects, particularly the emphasis on transparency beyond the core leadership group and the idea of systematically gathering feedback from the broad employee base or from customers, those are largely modern concepts. They weren't central to Rockefeller's historical management style, which really prioritized centralized control and production efficiency above almost everything else.
But the underlying drive for rigor, for structure, for strategic alignment, and for relentless execution, that's the core essence the modern habits are trying to capture and systematize.
Precisely. That's the connection. The Rockefeller Habits framework, whatever its historical fidelity, provides a practical, actionable checklist for modern companies trying to instill discipline, alignment, and strategic execution today. It's inspired by the results of his approach, even if it's not a literal transcription of his methods. Its value really lies in its utility as a modern management tool.
It almost feels like the modern habits describe what a high-performing, disciplined organization looks like on the surface. But studying Rockefeller's life and methods shows us the why and the how behind it. You know, the intense personal discipline, the specific operational methods he pioneered, the unwavering commitment to that long-term vision that actually created that outcome in the first place.
That's a really key insight, I think. The modern habits are often the observable behaviors and structures. Rockefeller's story reveals the foundational character traits, the obsessive drive, and the strategic thinking that underpinned it all.
And it brings up that fascinating kind of ongoing debate in business, doesn't it? Is extraordinary success primarily the product of unique individual genius and drive, like Rockefeller clearly possessed? Or is it mainly the result of implementing replicable systems and processes like the habits framework suggests?
Yeah, Rockefeller's story makes a powerful case for the great man theory of history, in a business sense, while the habits framework tries to systematize success, making it seem more replicable.
Maybe the most potent formula involves both. Visionary leadership that also has the discipline to build and consistently enforce rigorous systems.
That seems likely. And it's absolutely crucial to remember when drawing lessons that while we can adapt the essence of his rigor, that relentless pursuit of efficiency, the fanatical cost control, building strong structures, long-term strategic planning, investing in innovation, we must discard his specific methods that relied on crushing competition through means that are now considered unethical or are flat out illegal.
Right. Predatory pricing, secret deals, collusion, those are not the takeaways.
Definitely not. The values and the underlying principles of discipline and vision, but they have to be applied responsibly and ethically within today's legal and social context.
So when we step back and try to assess John D. Rockefeller Sr., what is the true measure of this titan? It's clearly got to be more than just the staggering wealth or the sheer scale of the monopoly he built.
Yeah, his monumental impact, the reason we're still talking about him so intensely, seems to stem directly from that unique and incredibly powerful combination. That relentless, almost microscopic discipline applied across a vast enterprise, coupled with an audacious, industry-shaping long-term vision.
His discipline was tangible, right? In every tiny detail, every cost saved, every rigid routine maintained. That's what powered the execution.
And his vision allowed him to see order where everyone else just saw chaos. To plan decades ahead, anticipate needs the market didn't even know it had yet, and invest massively in infrastructure that would dominate for generations.
And his legacy is just incredibly complex, isn't it? It's been debated fiercely for over a century.
Fiercely. During his lifetime, he was simultaneously hailed as this unparalleled business genius and absolutely condemned as a ruthless monopolist, crushing competitors, manipulating markets.
Then the muckraking era, especially Ida Tarbell's work, really cemented his image for many as a kind of bogeyman, the ultimate symbol of unchecked corporate greed.
Right. And the 1911 Supreme Court decision ordering the breakup of Standard Oil was a direct societal and legal response to those deep concerns about his concentrated power. Yet, you absolutely cannot deny the transformative impact of his organizational innovations, the unprecedented scale of efficiency he brought to industry, And then, of course, his later, truly unparalleled philanthropic efforts.
Funding major universities like the University of Chicago, pioneering medical research through the Rockefeller Institute, establishing massive public health initiatives.
His life story just perfectly encapsulates that dramatic, often incredibly contentious transition of American capitalism during the Gilded Age, that shift from an economy of small, independent businesses to one dominated by massive, integrated industrial giants. He didn't just witness it, he drove it.
And the core principles we've spent this time unpacking, the sheer intensity of his discipline and execution, the clarity and the scale of his vision, those seem undeniably still relevant, maybe even essential lessons for modern leaders and organizations.
I think they are. They remain both a challenge and an inspiration. The sheer ambition and the rigor he applied are just staggering, even today. He serves as a compelling model for things like strategic foresight, operational excellence, relentless process improvement, and yes, eventually, incredibly impactful philanthropy.
There's always a but with Rockefeller.
There's always a but. His story also provides this stark historical reminder of the potential for abuses when power becomes too concentrated, and underscores the critical importance of ethical considerations in business practice. You can't separate the success for the methods used to achieve it.
And it's vital to see his success within its historical context, right? His unique attributes thrived in that specific environment of the Gilded Age, this nascent, largely unregulated industry, undergoing rapid technological change, massive societal shifts.
Absolutely. He was a product of his times as much as he shaped them. So the real lessons for us today aren't about trying to replicate his exact methods, many of which, as we've said, are illegal or unethical now. It's about thoughtfully adapting the foundational principles, that rigor, that foresight, that structured execution to the very different challenges and ethical expectations of the contemporary business world.
And his controversial legacy really forces us, you included, to think hard about how we define business success today. If success is measured only by wealth and market dominance, well, his achievement was almost unparalleled.
Almost superhuman in that narrow sense.
But his story shows so clearly that those metrics alone are insufficient, maybe even dangerous, if the pursuit of them comes at too great a societal cost or harms fair competition.
Exactly. The measure of a titan like Rockefeller is ultimately multifaceted, complex, and widely debated even now. It extends far beyond just the balance sheet. It has to include the lasting impact, positive and negative, on industry structure, on society, and on our very understanding of what constitutes responsible enterprise.
Which leaves us with this powerful, lingering question to consider, kind of pulling together everything we've discussed. Given the immense power that Rockefeller clearly derived from his extreme discipline and his sweeping vision, how do individuals and organizations navigating today's complex landscape find the right balance? The balance between that relentless drive for efficiency and scale, which is still necessary for success, and the ethical imperative to foster fair competition, treat people well, and contribute positively to societal well-being. Can you truly have one that ruthless efficiency and scale without compromising the other in the long run?
That's the fundamental tension, isn't it? His life embodied it perhaps more starkly than anyone else's. And it's just as relevant, maybe even more so today than it was a century ago.
So we've taken a really deep dive into the material you shared with us, exploring the absolutely critical roles of discipline and vision in the life and empire of John D. Rockefeller Sr. We've examined the complexity of his legacy and tried to draw out lessons both cautionary and inspirational that resonate in today's business world.
Hopefully you, listening in, now have a much deeper, more detailed understanding of these key aspects of one of history's most impactful and, controversial figures.
And that question about balancing efficiency and ethics, that's certainly one that warrants continued thought and discussion long after this deep dive ends.
For sure.
If you're keen to explore more aspects of the vast Rockefeller legacy, maybe the nitty-gritty details of the Standard Oil breakup or the full scope of his extraordinary philanthropy later in life, or perhaps delve even further into the context of the Gilded Age, well, this deep dive is just one piece of a much larger story.
There's so much more there.
Absolutely. You can find more insights and explorations just like this one right here on the Rockefeller Chronicles channel, so please be sure to subscribe and check out our other deep dives related to this incredible, complex history. We'd also genuinely love to hear your thoughts on that balancing act we just discussed, efficiency versus ethics. Can it be done? Let us know.